Let's start then. Thank you everyone for joining. This is a very improv or not very well-structured like meeting about stand-up properties, because we all love stand-up properties. And basically the idea is an open like discussion. And I believe we all here are working with stand-up properties or similar things. So they just try to share our perspective and how this benefits our own applications or structures. So I don't know if anyone wants to start. Well, I can start. I'm Horacio. Actually Iskak and Alex will work together in Minter, which is a decentralized publishing platform that we're using stand-up properties quite heavily, or actually is in our core. So we're deeply passionate about it, and we have our own, let's say, implementation or use case. I'm happy to share our findings or how we're using it, and also share ideas with others. So anybody else wants to also share?
I can, if you like. So I basically started thinking about standoff in 2017 when I wanted to enter in some historical documents and annotate them. And I realized that XML wasn't going to be very useful for the kind of scenarios with overlap that I thought I might encounter. At the time, I couldn't find any standoff property text editors that would let me type in and update text, but also do standoff. So basically, I prototyped one in JavaScript, and that took me to some interesting places, because at the same time I had a graph database at the back end with basically a kind of a hypergraph built on Neo4j, and the standoff properties ended up becoming a kind of connective tissue between the text and the entities in the graph database. And since then, I haven't really looked back. I've been playing around with what you can do with standoff in the client, and also kind of from the server side, using standoff properties as nodes, as sort of conduits between words and entities and bigger blocks of text, and finding kind of latent relationships between things. So yeah, it's been fun. And since then, I also sort of felt like I needed to work up a different UI for the editor, and it kind of spilled over to the desktop UI. And I partnered with Adam Sherwood about a bit over a year ago, and we've been rebuilding Codex on a different foundation, but although it uses standoff is a core part of that, and so is the graph. But we're building a local first application with a new standoff re-implemented on top of a different text editor. But basically, we'll be taking some of the lessons we found with the editor that I write, and bringing them across to the new one, and yeah, just seeing where that goes.
Sounds awesome, man. How about you, Forrest?
You mentioned local first, and you also mentioned Neo4j, and I wonder, how does this fit together? Do everyone have, like, it's also a browser application, right? So
well, that's kind of, yeah. So originally it started as a web application with Neo4j database on the server. But we made the decision about a year ago that we didn't think it was viable to continue with Neo4j, because we wanted to do a local first application with zero latency. And we had looked at a number of different graph databases, and most of them were really server-based, even though they're quite powerful, but we just didn't want any connection to a web server. Even if you have to put a Docker install, we want to be able to run everything in a self-contained Electron app. So basically, we're building on top of an RDF based database in TypeScript, and have made some extensions to that. But essentially, that's essentially gone from Neo4j to a more RDF based model. But we're still having nodes and edges and edge properties and hyper edges and stuff like that.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. What about you, Forrest? Are you working with something standard properties like, or something exciting?
Well, I might need a definition. I am the product I'm working on is CAD for makers. So like patterns for laser cutters and things that could make stuff like this. And one of my pieces in that is making the README. And in our README, you can embed components that make up the designs. So we have like components inside of documentation. So there's that connection. But I've been thinking like how it might be able to go the other way, like doing annotations within the CAD interface. And then like, yeah, so how to do those kinds of connections if both sides of it can embed the other side, like yeah, just thinking about that user experience and stuff. But maybe it wouldn't hurt to define standoff properties for posterity.
Well, maybe, yeah. Who wants to give it a shot of a very brief?
And you coined the term, Ian, standoff properties, or?
I actually picked it up from a Brisbane-based academic called Desmond Schmidt, who has done a lot of work. He's a classics, comes from a classics background in computing, and he's done a lot of work in standoff properties and in multivariant text documents. So he's very interested in tracking branching text from editions of poetry. And his paper on standoff was the first thing I came across, and inspired me to do the standoff editor. And he basically defines it as, because they're kind of different flavors of standoff, basically. Like maybe in some ways you could even regard like a style sheet as a kind of standoff, standoff data collection, because it's not inside the document, and it refers to entities expected to be in the document and so on, but it can be mixed, can be injected. You can inject more style sheets, and you can filter things on them. But basically, he defines standoff properties as textual metadata that are stored external to the text. And I think, for me, that definition, I think, works quite well, because it's sort of vague on what the metadata is, but what's important is that it's not embedded as any encoding into the text itself. For example, standoff XML can achieve a similar result to standoff properties, but it ends up having to like insert XML elements to identify a position within the text document, that this is the start of the standoff or something. Or one might say that this annotation crosses this element and this element, kind of joins them. So I think that's why I ended up using his term standoff properties, because it sort of seemed to be distinguished from any of the XML techniques. And in my case, I actually represent standoff as just JSON objects which are packaged with a text string.
Yeah, I believe one of the benefits that at least we are thinking standard properties can bring in our case is the fact that we can extract information easy and not extract the actual information like easier than having some format that it's like embedded, or some type of information, some type of data that has embedded styles or structure like XML or Markdown or DOS or HTML, for example. So the idea that we can benefit from that is one of the ways, and the other one is what you said, which is you can overlap properties without the need or the limitations of a structure. Like, for example, HTML. In HTML, for example, we also treat links as standard properties, and that's something that you cannot do with structured like syntax like HTML. You cannot. I mean, you can, but it's not semantic and it's not valid. But essentially, you like, that's one of the other events. I believe, Lian, in your case, because you're not only thinking about formatting, which is the normal thing to do when you think about standard, or like the number place to go when you're thinking about standard properties, but you're also thinking about like the actual like giving meaning to the data that it's being underlined, which is very interesting also.
I think what I found is that I realized I really liked Standoff as a unified model for describing regions of text, and those descriptions can be stylistic, like italics or bold or whatever, or they could be a bit more involved than that. They could be to do with blocks of text and alignment and so on, but they can just as easily be semantic or syntactical, and that's something I've had a lot of interest with Standoff, is injecting like layers of syntax annotations with semantic annotations, and having them all mix and match. And because they exist just as an array of properties, you can filter in and out. You can give the user the ability to switch things on and off, and they can highlight parts of the text which correspond to different syntax or semantics. I think the other thing as well is that I really came to believe while working with it that like every technology has a kind of implicit system of values behind it, and while HTML is very powerful for structuring documents, the idea of annotation is something which has been locked into a single user mode. So we have, in HTML or XML, the resources at our disposal force us to have one annotation over a bit of text. They force us to limit the scope of it, so we can't overlap them. But there's the other aspect to it, the social aspect, which is, if it's just the first person who gets in there and makes the annotation, then all of the other contributions are excluded by default. So there is a kind of ethical implication in a way to Standoff. And so I started using the term, I started talking about Standoff revolution, because it has a social dimension of literally capturing people's intentions and voices and opinions, which is almost impossible with a hierarchical markup environment, which is more top-down and less tolerant of different opinions, even if you change your mind and you want to layer and compare. So there are, it was interesting. I wasn't expecting to kind of come to that opinion, but I felt like there is a kind of ethical dimension in a way to Standoff as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting, like to because usually annotations seems to be like something personal, or seems to feel that is something personal, which is, and it's hard to, sometimes it is structured like systems to store the intent. And it's kind of cool that it's also not only something that is visual, which is something that you
Yeah.
can overlap, but also helps you to understand what was the actual meaning of that like action, which is
Yes.
very interesting actually. It's kind of cool. And how does, because I mean, if we all are like, I don't know if how many of us have been working with standard properties, at least 3 of us. I don't know, Forrest, maybe also you too, but it's not an easy jump to do. So I'm very curious about what is the more closer benefit that you're taking from something that standard properties, apart from, of course, what we said, that you can overlap and all that, but managing that, like these things that we're doing, like is an implementation detail that we can take it from elsewhere or doing in another time or in another place, and we can still use like this structured data and all that. I'm just curious about like what is the intrinsic benefit that you're seeing over just analyzing events and the data and then try to come up with the same result. I don't know if that makes sense, the question, but
Yeah, I mean, do you mean as well, like from the point of view of the creator of the standoff system?
yeah, I mean how, like let me try to rephrase it. Like usually the standard, like for example, in our case, in our rich text editor, the fact that we're storing things as the standoff way is not easily visible to the end user. How, like what is, like I believe in the terms of semantics, is more visual, or is actually more visible to get the benefit, because you can actually see these overlaps, and you can understand that, okay, you're able to do those things, but for other kinds of standard property, for example, in your case, Forest, which is actually applying annotations or applying changes or whatever formatting to these 3D elements, how does that, like, what is the benefit of doing that rather than the benefit of the user using it? Like, what is the overlap, or how can we say, okay, this is beneficial, we should do this, it's a lot of work, but we should do this because it's better for X, Y, and Z. In a, yeah.
I can feel like I can say something if someone else doesn't want to jump in. I found, because in my case, because I hadn't found any existing standoff text editors, I had to develop it from scratch, and it followed a very different model from building like a rich text HTML editor. The assumption in my model was that every character would be treated as a cell, as an object, and essentially the standoff would be a linked list. And in a way, it eventually sort of started to mirror kind of a graph-like structure, with links to and from paragraph to paragraph and so on. But the other implication was that even though there's performance implications for bigger documents, working on that kind of granular level of one cell per character, gives you a lot of information about the character in the document object model, like where it is on the screen. And it made me realize that there's a lot of creative styling potential with standoff, which is very, very difficult to achieve the usual CSS effects. An example would be
Did we lost Ian?
Yeah, we lost Ian. Well, he's frozen right now, so.
I thought that was me.
Oh. So
Long way
sad.
to going under.
I mean, we have there's a message somewhere. No. Oh, he left. Yeah, he just maybe it's the internet. Maybe he will come back. I mean, we've been half an hour. I don't know if there's anything like meaningful that you wanted to get from this meeting. At least for me is okay. Ian's back. Nice. Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
Sorry about that. I just switched to my hotspot.
That's fine. It's all right.
Was someone else talking? Would you like me to continue?
No. You can go ahead. I was just changing a little
Talking
gears, but
about how treating each character as a separate object gives a lot of flexibility and creative power.
Yes, good, because it also allows you to because I'm storing the reference of the standoff range to the cells that are that define the start and the end of the range. Basically accessing the part of the DOM that is related to that annotation range is basically instantaneous, because you're just jumping through a object pointer to a HTML object, which means you could do stuff. For example, I was just mentioning before, if let's say you transcribed a couple of pages from a text document, and you put that into these 2 pages you put into one file, standoff. You could mark up where the beginning, so where the end of the first page is and where the beginning of the second page is, and it might end halfway through the sentence. But the standoff doesn't care about that. That's just an overlapping annotation. But once you have that information and it's connected to the DOM, you could, for example, generate an SVG polygon that represents the shape of that page, and it could flow around, the point where it breaks off halfway in the sentence. And you could have that polygon update in real time as you're changing the text, adding and deleting. So the page block will reform around the annotation. So that was something I hadn't anticipated working with standoff in that way. Was that there's stylistic implications, there's implications for the text editor itself. There are kind of rich text effects, which would be difficult to do. Maybe you can't really do in CSS. You have to use something like SVG to draw over a region. But with standoff, that kind of thing, that the barrier to using SVG directly in that space becomes a lot lower, because you've got all of that infrastructure there to work with to address the content on the screen. And so that started me thinking about, well, what else could you do? Go beyond some of the usual CSS effects, could you do video effects, or could you do interesting, blurring effects, whatever. And I think there's a lot of potential there with a cell-based system for addressing characters, where you can use CSS to address it at the block level, or to address a range of characters. But you're also not limited by that. You've got a lot of information for SVG to be integrated into that space as well, which is something that we're not so used to. But it does make it a lot more richer and interesting and colorful. And I think the other thing I came to believe was that the text editors that we work in are really confine us compared to paper. They really restrict the type of thoughts that we can write down and the things that we can annotate. And we almost don't notice it. We just accept these limitations, but because we're kind of building along the grain of HTML. But if you have a different model for that text editor, then there's different limitations and different possibilities, and different creative possibilities. So that's been fun. Like I've done some stuff with animation, like having animated annotations, with that JavaScript behaviors attached to do things like spin things around, or and there's other possibilities that one could do. Could treat annotations like components, almost like a React component or a solid component. You could have it encapsulate behavior, which could go off and connect to data sources, and so it kind of made me think about annotation in a different way, not just like describing something. Here's the data, this is the metadata, but it could also include behavior with that annotation, so that a chunk of JavaScript to implement that annotation. And once you've got that concept, it becomes more powerful than just describing what's there. You can affect what's there. You can have it go off and connect to other things as well.
How do you treat like things like embedded objects, for example, things like embedding an image within the text? Is it do you treat it also as a standoff property?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is what I've done so far, but I mean, this is where it gets a bit, you start running up against, I think, not so much the limitations of it, but it's more comfortable to do this kind of thing, to have components expressed as XML, I think, just to say, well, bracket image, or bracket widget or something. I think it's nicer to read. It's easier to look at and understand what's happening there. But essentially, what I was doing was having like what I called a zero width annotation. So an annotation which describes the point between two characters. And that could be used. I used that originally for inserting footnote numbers. So these footnote numbers could be visualized as annotations, but they don't actually exist in the text stream. So you don't see footnote, you don't see bracket 1, bracket 2, bracket 3. The annotation itself tells you that, and it's injected into the editor between the characters. And so you can kind of use that model for injecting widgets, but at the same time, it's not as nice. I mean, really, that's a more structural way of thinking of text, and probably something like a hybrid between structured elements and standoff, I think, would work better.
That was like in Minter, we've been working on Minter for about 3 years, and this is a decentralized publishing platform and knowledge collaboration tool. So you can publish things, you can reuse things, everything is cryptographically signed and immutable. And we've been inspiring a lot of our work by we got inspirations from founding fathers of hypertext, Ted Nelson with his Xanadu project, and Dagan Wilbert with his many, many different ideas. And so we've been trying to I think we figured a couple of years ago, we found out about Codex, and I was looking a lot into how you went about implementing all of this. But all of this time, I think I don't know if I changed my mind or I still have some concerns because there's a lot of trade-offs when you dive into this model. So you lose the ability, like what people sometimes want to have plain text files, and standard properties don't play well with plain text files. This case of embedding objects within the text, we ended up doing similar. Instead of doing zero width annotation, we ended up inserting a Unicode. There is a special character in Unicode called object replacement character, and we insert that one and we annotate it. So we create an annotation saying that is an image. But it seems like then sometimes it seems like there is I don't know if it's impedance mismatch between different areas of where a text could be whenever you publish it, whenever you send it around, whenever you annotate it. So indeed, seems like it would be great if there would be a format that allows you to mix and match both inline stuff and standoff or overlay stuff. And I think I don't have answers to any of these questions. And I wonder what's your opinion about it. For example, like when you
Yeah.
publish things, it seems like sometimes if you publish some text, you want certain annotations to come within the text, along with the text. But if everything is stored as a standoff, then somehow you need to group them together, create a separate container of some sort to dispatch the whole text and the standoff properties within it. And if that text is evolving, it seems like it gets more and more complicated. And I think it seems like there's no easy solution, and it's hard to do, like, be a diehard standoff property person. Like, I'm doing everything with standoff. And we haven't found any good approach around it, I think, yet. So I wonder what's your opinion about it, like how to deal
think,
about it.
Yeah, I think my feeling is that if you want to insert something more, like if you don't just want to decorate the text, but you want to insert something which is in a way its own kind of text, like a picture, an object or something, and you're not wanting to, and it's not appropriate to annotate that as a text range. I think your options are, you can either, just put in a code, like a Unicode symbol, or, I mean, in some ways I would say, why not just put in something and like a markdown format and say, well, this is this object. The only thing that what you lose in that case is some of the naive fluency of just querying that string and saying, one of the great things about standoff is that you don't have any issues with text being cut off at artificial boundaries. Things can just continue running, and you also have, unlike XML, white space is significant. It's included and kept. So if you want to query by white space, one word with a space at the end, whatever, you can do that. I think basically, I came to think of standoff as being, standoff is just a system of adding decorations to a text stream. That text stream doesn't have to be plain text. In a pure sense, it should be plain text, and it should all be done through, zero width annotations and Unicode identifiers and Unicode characters. But there's no reason why you can't mix some form of markup with that. It all comes down to, well, how do you display it then? And that comes down to the editor. So for me, standoff is a kind of a circle between it's what you see on the screen is the editor, and it's the format of how you export it. And that actually, I think in some ways is actually more portable than a lot of HTML and XML and other formats, even Markdown. Because, for example, in my text editor, in my standoff editor, I might say that this is italics, or let's say this is a certain kind of semantic annotation. This refers to an entity. Now, your text editor may choose to ignore that. Just go, you know what? I'm not interested in that markup. I don't have anything to visualize that markup. I'm just going to ignore it. Now, maybe it's visible in some kind of section where you can see everything, but I'm not going to render it. Whereas with HTML or Markdown, your Markdown renderer has to deal with that. So with standoff, it's very easy to innovate and say, I'm just going to keep on adding different types of annotation types. In my case, I kind of use a kind of namespaces, to break it down a little bit. But basically, this kind of anarchy would make a standards person sweat, but it's also a freedom as well. So you can say, well, look, I can have an entity type, and you can have an entity type, and both of our entities can live together in the same document, or you can have your data and I can have my data. And it's up to the standoff editor to choose what to do with that. So the actual format is rich. It doesn't make any assumptions on the editor how to handle it. It's up to the editor to choose how to visualize it, what to do with it. And I think as well, there's also security implications, because you're not even sending Markdown over the wire. You're not sending anything executable over the wire. You're sending plain text plus a block of JSON or something. And that it only becomes, it's only rendered in the client by the standoff editor itself. And so there can be, you have complete control over how that is rendered. So I think there's a nice aspect, I would say, that you kind of bypass cross-site scripting attacks as well, because you're not actually executing HTML or JavaScript in there. You're just describing, the appearance or the intention of the text, and it's up to the editor to implement that intention. The other possibility is that in your package, this is something I was playing with, you can export the text, export the annotation data, but you could also export your own implementation of the tag renderer. So you could say, let's say I have an entity annotation, assuming we have some kind of standard for what that entity tag renderer would expect to have passed to it. You could say, well, I'm going to give you an implementation for how to render that entity in JavaScript. For example, in what way do you want to underline that or style that or something? That you would assume that the other editor that receives that would be somewhat similar, but you could pass along entirely new tags with the code to execute that, if that was something that was that you were interested in doing. Maybe a community might find that quite powerful. But I think, to answer your question, I think there must be a way to mix structure with decoration. And I don't think with standoff that you have to give up structure. All you're saying is that structure has to be interpreted at the point that it reaches the editor. And also, you may, in injecting that structure, you may be giving up some freedom in terms of writing regex or writing queries on the plain text. You can no longer assume it's just a sequence of text anymore.
And whenever I wanted to bring up this concept of offsets, that each standoff property annotates the range of text given offsets to that text. And I wonder, what's your opinion about if you say that, imagine that we have this text that has some structure or has some inline annotations, I don't know, markdown things for embedding images or something like that. Would you think that so imagine if it's a link, right? Markdown link or markdown image. So it's a link that has a bunch of characters.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's just like one, it has the length of one. But if you create more standoff properties on top of that plain text that has some structure inside, would you count those offset this range as one or as each character?
That's something I'm just wrestling with as well. But I think it depends on how purely you want to treat standoff as textual decoration. I think in some ways it makes sense to keep that quite a severe separation, because then you don't have to make any assumptions about the meaning or the definition of what an element is. You don't have to have any foreknowledge of, this is standoff, but it has to be legal Markdown, or this is standoff, this has to be legal XML. If you just say, I'm just annotating X to Y, then from a standoff point of view, it becomes very, very simple. Maybe it becomes, there's always the question of how readable is the standoff and how editable is it without the editor looking at the format directly. But I think with standoff, you have to give up a certain amount of tinkering, with the direct data that you would have with Markdown. Although maybe, I mean, one possibility I was thinking of was rather than basing annotations rather than having them based on character offsets, you could insert identifiers into the text to mark. They're simply identifiers of a position in a text. And then you could say this annotation refers to this identifier, and it ends at this identifier. And then in some ways that would be actually possible to be given a plain text standoff document, and you could add characters and delete characters to some extent without worrying about character offsets, because you're, rather than dealing with the assumption that there's a one-to-one between the textual range and the character offsets, you're assuming there's it's actually linked to an identifier. And I mean, this solution exists. I mean, it's been out there. It's basically an anchor tag, but I haven't tried implementing that myself, but I mean, in some ways, I think this might be a nice compromise for people who want to work with standoff without having the standoff tooling, if you could export it in a format like that. And that's the great thing about standoff. You can switch between these formats. So I could export, let's say I exported a character offset document as using identifiers to someone who only has a plain text editor, then they could keep on adding some text and they could give it back to me, and then it could convert it back into a character offset document to be visualized within the real-time editor. So that's a possibility too. I think in many ways, I think of standoff as like a base format, like a kind of an format underneath things, that you can. This is something that Blaine Cook has done a lot of work with at Condé Nast.
Yeah,
I was
Condé
gonna
Nast,
ask
Jason.
you about-
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about that as well.
Yeah, he does a lot of. They use standoff as a kind of universal format between all of their internal formats.
And
they
actually mix what you already said. They actually have like Markdown, and they add also standard properties on top of Markdown. So it's
right.
I've never thought about it. And now you mention it, it's like, okay, yeah, like why not? But I guess it's a compromise, right? It's always a compromise.
It's always a compromise.
And I believe this like standard properties, like the standard property also may have some metadata about, okay, what are you actually like annotating? Because maybe like we're here talking about text, but it's Markdown, or it's HTML, or it's a 3D element, or it's a canvas, or like it needs that in order for the client, which is the one that is rendering, and okay, I need to use this like values or this units to actually put something on the screen. So this is amazing. There's so much to talk about here. Oh my God.
Yeah, and but I wanted to, I don't know if I want, I don't know. I have so many questions actually. I don't know why I didn't ask them before. But regarding.
Yeah, just before you continue, just let you know we're 10 minutes before the hour. So I don't want to get too much into your time or your people's time. So maybe we can set something to continue this conversation asynchronously, or maybe like add some questions, or maybe like schedule another meeting. That'll be fun.
I'm happy.
But yeah, let's continue. But just to let you know that there's 10 minutes left.
Well, maybe we need, I don't know, we need to set up a working group of some sort or something. Because I remember watching a video from Blaine explaining adjacent and things. I think you were there as well. I think it was a Fission meetup or something. I don't remember that.
Yeah, it was a Fission course. Yeah.
So I don't know, some kind of a place where we could bring those ideas up and find solutions, because we all know, it seems like we understand that there are trade-offs, and if we work with, sometimes standoff cannot be the single tool to work with everything. So sometimes it
Yeah.
needs to be mixed and matched with other things. And maybe if we have a place where we can bring up those questions and ask for feedback and maybe find solutions to them, that would be great, I think. I don't know what
Well,
that, and
well, we can
preferably
start with the
asynchronous.
Discord channel, maybe I think, isn't there that the text and alternative?
Text and alternative, yeah.
Yeah, we could put some things there, and then we do some meetings and things, and there's a lot, I think, because I mean I'm surprised to see so many people interested in standoff, to be honest.
Yeah,
and I'd love to learn more of what you guys are doing with standoff.
yeah.
Like, what was that a question? Like, what are we doing with
Yeah,
standoff?
I'd love to. What are you guys doing with standoff yourselves? And how are you? Is it? Are you editing? Is this annotation of static documents or editable documents, or what's happening, and what's the use case?
It's a bit of mix. It's a bit of mix of everything, because we have so this is like a desktop application where you can write text, and then you publish it, and then other people can consume it, and then they can write their own text, and they can reuse parts of your text. And we also wanted to make, we followed the ideas of Engelbart about hierarchical documents and blocks and stuff like that. Things like Notion right now is doing, is becoming popular. And this idea of block-based text editors is becoming more and more mainstream. So we also have that. And basically we have these structural documents that can form hierarchies similar to Notion, where we can write paragraphs or embed images or transclude pieces of other documents. And all of the formatting that we have. So we have standoff properties at each block level, not at the level of the whole document.
Yeah, the hierarchy is not being like saved as a standoff property.
Yeah.
The
Right.
hierarchy is there, and then inside each block we have standard properties for everything. Actually.
Yeah, I think that works better inside the block level. It's
And
easier.
then we also have the idea that you can publish these documents, but then you want to edit them and maybe fix something or add something. So you have multiple revisions of that. And you might have multiple devices that you can do that. And then we want anyone to be able to edit anyone else's document. So all of this complexity
also,
piles up and makes everything much more complicated.
And also we have comments also, and comments are also stored as standard properties.
Right.
So and it's everything pointing to everything. Yeah.
Are the comments standoff documents as well? Are they blocks?
Yes, those are blocks. Yep.
Right.
Yeah. So you can actually
comments are separate things. Comments are like
separate entity.
Separate entities that point to the original.
But yeah, inside
guys, come on, be brave. Make the comments standoff documents.
Yeah. Okay. Let me try to explain clearly. So yeah, comments are this actually we have a conversation. So the conversation is the thing that we are adding to the block, as a standard property. And then this conversation is like there are comments pointing to that conversation. And each comment is a block that right now is just plain text, but it could have standard properties inside the block. So yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everything that is text should potentially be a standoff document. It doesn't matter how long or how short. If you think about it, even like the file name. If you have something in the system that's a name, a title, there's no reason why that shouldn't be standoff, because at the very least you have a plain text representation every time, which you can feed in, and you don't even have to worry about the standoff. You can give it to someone, you can export that, you can leave it out, whatever. But if you have the standoff anywhere there's text, then you have the possibility for, a kind of reflection, basically, or you have the possibility to inject those behaviors to any part of the system. So that's something that we're looking at with this new version of Codex.
Yeah, also one crazy idea that I also have in my mind, like very vague in my mind, is actually that it's like the way that the clients render annotations can be also composable. So maybe you have like the base version of rendering comments, but maybe you have a plugin that has like a fancy comment, and then you can use that and render it in a different way. And it doesn't matter at which level you are, you still have the base level of the behavior, but you can add on top whatever you need. Look, or whatever.
That's where you could even open it up to a marketplace. Someone could say, I want to make an annotation that makes it all look like beautiful Gothic lettering. I'll turn every character into SVG, animated SVG or something crazy. And from a document interchange point of view, all that is a annotation type. This thing is that. And if it's not understood by the client, it's just rendered as plain text. Or it can be converted. It could be downcast into something else, or upcast, whichever way it is. And it's a choice of the editor what to do. But then if you have that plugin, you can distribute the whatever the code is to be the renderer of that bit of text.
Yep, essentially that. But yeah, it's not easy, and I mean it's super awesome. It's super awesome I'm very glad that we can actually like share these ideas and try to actually take action. Like let's do this working group. Let's try to share those, like, for example, these limitations between, okay, you have the standard property or you have like marks and IDs. Those are different like ways of implementing the same thing, and there are some trade-offs. Like we can actually talk about it and see the benefits and the pros and cons. And many other like things, maybe like using structure as a separate place, like as a separate thing, and then just adding like standard properties at block level, which is what we're doing, or just using structure like the page that you mentioned, which is also a standard property. So it gives some structure. So those things are just fascinating. So yeah, we need to try to like come up with some ideas and consensus. Not I don't know if it's a consensus, but at least share what we're trying to do and see some commonalities, see some common things. So yeah.
Well, I think it's too early for consensus, and the possibilities are too wide. And I think what's more interesting is just to share and try out a few things. And I think what I'm seeing is a lot of natural overlap. Pardon the pun. Like the way that the format that I landed upon for standoff property JSON is pretty similar to @JSON format. There's some other assumptions behind it. There's things that I do in the editor that might be different from what they do at Condé Nast, but the actual interchange format is very similar because it's not complicated, which is the beauty of standoff. And it's very extensible. And it's up to a lot of the fun is actually in the viewer or the editor or in the database queries of that content, whatever. So there's a lot of freedom to experiment and try different things, I think, without breaking the interchange format. So I think standoff in a way to me is like it's a bit like Lisp or something. It's so simple to build out of that it becomes really powerful because you're not stuck into these assumptions about hierarchy and one thing being one kind of text being acceptable within brackets, but not within quotation marks. And so we trade off some complexity when it comes to document structure. But I think we can work out some kind of acceptable compromise. And also, why can't the standoff document itself encode some of these assumptions? For example, a standoff document could say, this document uses character offsets, whereas this document uses character identifiers or something. And that could be packaged like almost like XML. Just say this is a self-describing standoff document, and your editor can do with that what it pleases.
Hmm.
Yes. Awesome. Nice. So it's been an hour. It was amazing. It's recorded. I paid for not cut anyone at the 40 minutes, so because it was super
Ah.
interesting. So
Thank you.
so let's have another one like soon. So let's try to like talk in the Discord channel and come up with
Be more
some.
active there, maybe.
Yeah, let's see. Let's try to come up ways to actually share this like either ideas, which
Yeah.
is awesome. So thanks
Should we
everyone.
do part 2 next week? Same time next week.
Let's do part 2 next week. We need to be let's try to find a way that the US, like our US folks, can also join. Maybe it's earlier for you, or I don't know, but let's find out.
Yeah.
So it would be awesome. Great. So
Brilliant.
thanks everyone. Thanks for joining,
Okay.
and see you on the next one. Yeah.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks guys.